Mr Speaker.
Denise Roche.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. I rise to take the final call for the Greens on the Prime Minister's statement. And I want to address the 4 priorities that he outlined. They were to responsibly manage the government's finances, to build a more competitive and productive economy, to deliver better public services to New Zealanders, and to support the rebuilding of Christchurch. Now, sir, I applaud the government's small army of PR and communications staff for being able to spin this government's appalling record on these issues into some kind of achievement. National has promised to responsibly manage the government's finance. The reality is that they've increased New Zealand's public debt to $120 billion, sir. A legacy of National's poor economic management is tax cuts to their rich mates and giveaways to dodgy corporates. It promised to build a more competitive and productive economy. Instead, it built an economy that was built on property speculation, ask anyone in Auckland, on casino capitalism and on unsustainable practices. It's failed to meaningfully diversify the economy and implement a vision towards a greener and more sustainable economy. And our trading fortunes seem to rise and fall with the dairy prices. And we see as the result of this, farms carrying nearly $60 billion in debt, with dairy farms carrying $40 billion of that debt. And nearly 1 in 10 farmers is under financial stress there. The government's single-minded focus on bigger, more intensive farming endangers our fragile ecosystems. It pressures farmers into intensifying, and it undermines New Zealand's #1 strength, our clean, green reputation. Sir, this government claims to have provided better public services. It's certainly been very good at delivering public services to further private interests, to places like Serco, to Sky City, and let's not forget charter schools. And it's certainly been very good at replacing democratically elected bodies in favour of appointed cronies. We see this with Southern DHB and governance in Christchurch. But the facts speak for themselves, sir. National's approach is not working. Currently, there's 129 days of waiting time to get a state house if you are in urgent need. 1 in 3 people needing a house are turned away from and taken off the waiting lists to help the government fudge the books with their creative accounting. The government's hardline ideology is pressuring our hard-working public servants. Our nurses and doctors are having to cope with nearly $2 billion, $2 billion in underfunding. Our universities are slipping in the world rankings, and our Department of Conservation is struggling to fulfil its core responsibilities due to budget cuts. The reality on the ground, sir, was exposed a couple of weeks ago by the Salvation Army's report. And in it they say, and as we know, there's still 220,000 kids living in poverty. There's still 150,000 notifications for potential child abuse this year. And there's over 55,000 food parcels being provided by the Salvation Army. Only on Planet K can the number of kids remaining in poverty increase, despite the economy growing 12% since 2010. The reality about our public service is that it cannot continue to struggle with underfunding. Political reporter Andrea Vance was correct. Instead of having better public services, we have bitter public services. And despite the government's glossy PR, our hard-working teachers, nurses, doctors and police are bearing the cost and having to do much, much more with less. And that means that our most vulnerable, our kids living in poverty, regional New Zealand, our new migrants, they're bearing the costs of these stealth cuts. Now, let me just talk a little bit about Christchurch and the promises there. My colleagues from Christchurch have already touched on this, but allow me to ask the question once more. How can the government be listing its rebuilding of Christchurch as an achievement and then several days later slash the funding for mental health services in the area? Rebuilding there is more than replacing bricks and mortar. It's about supporting people who've been hurt and are facing losses. It's about wrapping support around the vulnerable and vulnerable communities, and it's about acknowledging that the loss of friends, of family, businesses, and the ways of life can be painful and difficult, and it requires help. I pay tribute to the incredible resilience and courage and fortitude of the people of Christchurch, and I condemn this government who, by their actions, are failing the people of Christchurch and the people of New Zealand. The government has repeatedly promised a brighter future for New Zealand, but it's always talked a better game than it's been prepared to deliver. For ordinary working New Zealanders, we've gone backwards in terms of rights at work. We've gone backwards in terms of the work climate, where lots and lots of public servants are feeling bullied and fearful, and we've gone backwards about zero-hour contracts. The Prime Minister promised a brighter future for New Zealanders, but actually he's left every New Zealander in the dark. The recent increase of the minimum wage to $15.25 an hour, and the gap between that and the living wage of $19.80 reflects that reality. Since 2009, the highest paid third of New Zealanders have seen their incomes increase 8 times as much as the lowest paid third. Last year, the government promised to outlaw zero-hour contracts, but instead of moving on that, what they're doing is attempting to legalise it. Last year, the government promised a gold-plated TPPA, but we're being sucked in and stuck with an agreement that will cost 5,000 jobs and leave us open to being sued by big corporates. There's a better way, though. There's a much better way, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting to note what the Prime Minister didn't talk about. Not once did the Prime Minister mention the word inequality or the word poverty. Not once did the Prime Minister address the growing gap between the haves and have-nots in this country. And only once did he mention climate change, and only then in passing. A progressive Prime Minister would have talked about child poverty and supported measures to fix it, like our breakfast in schools bill. They could have supported that, like maybe decent incomes for families. A progressive Prime Minister would have talked about how climate change is the greatest challenge we face, but it's also an opportunity for New Zealand to become world leaders in new, high-value, clean tech, low-carbon economy. A progressive Prime Minister would have talked about how we can have an economy that works for everyone, not just the very rich. And a progressive government with the Greens in it would do more than just talk and spin, sir. We would act on these issues and make sure that every single child in New Zealand is cared for and lives in a warm, dry home. And we would make sure ordinary New Zealanders would get a fair deal at work and a fair share of the benefits of a smart, thriving, green economy that works for everyone. We would make sure that we have rivers we can swim in, vibrant green cities and townships with fast, affordable, clean public transport. An Aotearoa with the Green Party at the heart of government will be a much kinder place, and certainly we would deliver a lot better than what this government has.